The British Parliament was split. On one side were the landlords. On the other were the free traders, who warned that unless the Corn Laws were repealed, they all risked the danger of violent revolution. But the landlords held out, rallied by a man who was destined to become one of the outstanding statesmen of the age, Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli was an unlikely champion of the landed interest. Though he had been baptized, his family was Jewish at a time when Jews were barred from public office in England. The young Disraeli had the elegant style of a man of means, but it was mostly bluff. He had no money, no land, no friends in high places. He joked that he had been born in a library, and his father certainly had one of the largest libraries in London. At the age of 20, Disraeli gave up the practice of law to write romantic novels. But his main purpose in writing was to pay off the huge debts he'd incurred from dabbling on the stock market. His real interest was in politics.
Disraeli's entry into politics was very difficult indeed. He was constantly heckled for being a Jew. People would turn up at the hustings with, with donkeys saying, "Go back to Jerusalem." I mean, he encountered a lot of very rough and rather nasty anti-Semitism. And yet he had one of the great things about Disraeli, I think, was his determination.
When he finally made it to Parliament, his florid style of speech and dress caused a sensation.
He dressed in clothes that amazed people. You know, he wore wonderful coloured outfits. He wore lots of jewellery. He wore sort of chains all over his waistcoat and rings outside his gloves, and he had very tightly ringleted hair. He liked shocking people.
And he certainly succeeded in shocking the House of Commons. His first speech had been drowned out by a torrent of laughter and abuse.
Sit down. Aye, sir. And though I sit down now, the time will come when you will hear me.
Disraeli modified his dress and tailored his speeches to the mood of Parliament. And with the battle over the Corn Laws, his time had come.
A lot of these country gentlemen really were not very good on their feet, but Disraeli was a brilliant orator.
Right or wrong, if they be in the wrong, they must...
It gave him the opportunity he'd been waiting for.
With which our present rulers...
But Disraeli's opportunism earned him many enemies in Parliament. By far the most important of these was William Ewart Gladstone. Gladstone's father had owned slaves in the West Indies, and Gladstone was tormented by a deep sense of guilt, which helped make him the conscience of the British Empire.
The most important thing in Gladstone's life is that whenever he has any problem, any political problem, he speaks to God. He asks for God's guidance. God is at the center of his life, at the center of his whole political being. And when he looks at imperialism, he says, is this godly? And he decides it isn't.
Gladstone had been elected to Parliament as a Tory, but the Irish famine wrenched at his conscience, and he switched sides to join the Liberals and Free Traders. The resulting battle would spark a lifelong feud between the two politicians, Disraeli and Gladstone, a feud that would divide Victorian England. But there was no doubt whose side the Queen was on. When Parliament finally voted on the repeal of the Corn Laws, Prince Albert appeared in the public gallery to demonstrate royal support for the Free Traders. Abuse from the Tory benches forced him to leave, and the Queen issued a fierce attack on his critics.
Gentlemen who do nothing but hunt all day, drink claret or port wine in the evening, and never study or read about any of these questions.
The Free Traders eventually won over enough Tories to break the landlords' power. The Corn Laws were repealed, and Britain finally opened its doors to the grain harvests of America.
The ayes have it.
Many feared it was too late. The stubborn resistance of the landlords had provoked popular fury in the towns and cities of Britain, and at a dangerous time for the British royal family. 1848 would prove to be the year of revolution. It began in southern Italy and spread rapidly across the continent of Europe. Armed mobs exploded into the streets, storming the palaces of their rulers and raising the red flag of revolution. From the sanctuary of her medieval palace at Windsor, the Queen confided to her uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians,
The state of politics in Europe is very critical, and one feels very anxious for the future.
revolution would eventually topple the thrones of France, Russia, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, and Turkey. And it was not only Victoria's throne that was at risk. The shots missed, but it was the first serious attempt on Victoria's life, and it would not be the last. In the spring of 1848, Victoria's government feared that the revolution had spread to Britain. Their agents warned that 1 million men were planning to gather in London for a march on Parliament. Panic gripped the capital. Cannon were posted on the bridges across the River Thames. Thousands of police and troops were brought into the city. The fearful government smuggled the royal family aboard a train to take them to their seaside palace off the south coast of England.
Albert was very frightened. Victoria was frightened. She did not want to go. She felt that it looked unheroic to leave. But it looked as if there might be a real revolution.
As the royal family was hurried to safety, London braced itself for the invasion of 1 million men bent on bloody revolution. But on the morning of April 10th, just 30,000 demonstrators turned up. They were outnumbered by over 100,000 troops and special constables. At the first spark of violence, the leaders of the protest lost their nerve. They implored the crowd to disperse. Then the weather took a hand. The threatened revolution was drowned in a violent outbreak of English rain.
They expected hundreds of thousands of people to gather and march across the bridges to Parliament and present this monster petition. Very few people actually turned up. It was a great disappointment. The English just aren't revolutionists.
When the news reached the Queen in her seaside refuge, she rejoiced.
Thank God. The procession has turned out a complete failure. The loyalty of the people at large has been very striking, and their indignation at their peace being interfered with by such wanton and worthless men, immense.
But Prince Albert had a much more realistic view of the situation. The revolution had been averted, but the threat remained as strong as ever. Albert believed that the only way to preserve the monarchy was to improve the conditions of the poor. The British people had to be persuaded that free trade would bring in a new age of peace and prosperity, not just for the manufacturers, but for the whole nation. The problem was, how were they to be convinced?
Albert liked the idea of using trade to liberalize the world in general. He liked the idea of trade creating communications and a better life for people worldwide.
Prince Albert believed that free trade was not just an economic theory, it was almost a sort of religion. Free trade would provide universal happiness throughout the world.
In 1849, Prince Albert met one of the great prophets of this new religion, Henry Cole, writer, artist, architect, and one of those Victorian gentlemen who buzzed with ideas that could change the world. He told the prince of his bold new dream. They would build a cathedral of free trade, a giant temple in the heart of London, to exhibit the art and industry of all nations. Every country in the world would be invited to send the most beautiful and the most useful of its creations to London, to unite the world in a dream of universal peace through trade. The prince was enthralled.
Prince Albert was in many ways a very idealistic figure. And this was not only to project the majesty of Great Britain across the world, it was also to emphasize the fact that we were all interconnected.
Victoria shared Albert's enthusiasm and appointed him president of a royal commission to organize what would be known as the Great Exhibition of the Works and Industry of All Nations, the world's first international trade fair. The Queen offered one of the royal parks, Hyde Park in the center of London, as the site for the exhibition. But Prince Albert's vision was resisted by the same forces that had opposed the repeal of the Corn Laws. First, they objected that it would bring hordes of foreigners into London.
Well, there was very great concern about the invasion of foreigners into this country. Xenophobia, I think, was quite rife at that time. There was concerns about disease being brought into the city.
The critics then shifted their attack to the building itself. The plan first chosen by the Royal Commission resembled a giant dome. It was held to ridicule, but when it was revealed that a famous avenue of trees would have to be cut down to make room for it, the mirth turned to anger. Save the trees became a popular rallying cry for Albert's critics in press and parliament.
Are the trees to be sacrificed for one of the greatest frauds, greatest humbugs, greatest absurdities ever known?
The real target of this attack was Prince Albert himself. He was mocked as the uncrowned king of the royal nursery, the foreign stud who could sire 9 children, but was fit for little else. But behind the mockery was the fear that Albert represented a threat to the established order.
In many ways, Albert was far ahead of his time. People in government didn't want to move as fast as Albert wanted to move. And so he became something of a suspect person to the politicians who were more conservative than he was.
Victoria and Albert were at their wits' end. It wasn't just Albert's reputation that was at stake. It was their dream. The dream that world trade could secure world peace. The prince wrote to his brother Ernst in despair.
We shall probably be defeated and have to give up the whole exhibition. You see, we do not lie on a bed of roses.
Then, with the project on the verge of collapse, help came from an unexpected source. Joseph Paxton was a farmer's son. He had started work at the age of 15 as an undergardener on the great estate of the Duke of Devonshire in the north of England. But like Brunel and Cole and so many other Victorians, Paxton had enormous self-belief and an imagination that soared beyond the limits of the Duke's plantations. His ideas for improvements caught the attention of his noble employer. They earned him rapid promotion. By the age of 40, he was manager of all the Duke's estates and an independently wealthy man with investments in bridges, railways, and gasworks. He even founded a newspaper with Charles Dickens as its editor. Paxton was the typical Victorian entrepreneur who seemed to excel at anything and everything. He knew that Prince Albert's exhibition was doomed without a building, so he turned his mind to designing one. He produced a preliminary sketch on a piece of blotting paper during a board meeting of one of his railroad companies. It was a giant greenhouse. Prince Albert and his team were delighted. A building made of glass could be assembled quickly and would do away with the need to cut down the trees in Hyde Park. The critics were felled with one stroke. In the fall of 1850, an army of 2,000 workmen descended on Hyde Park. The vast iron framework covering 19 acres of land was erected in just 9 weeks. The following week, 80 glaziers fitted 18,000 panes of glass. The critics prayed for a violent hailstorm, but it was a forlorn hope. Paxton's beautiful building won the hearts of the nation. It was opened by the Queen and Prince Albert on the 1st of May, 1851, and instantly became known as the Crystal Palace.
As far as the public is concerned, it was architecturally magical. It was such a marvelous building, it was so unlike anything that anybody had seen before, that in itself, I think, set the thing off on a marvelous passage.
For the first time, the Victorians saw their brave new world on show, with all its novelty and invention, and they were bewitched.
There was a tremendous impact. Everyone was excited to see this whole building and what was contained inside it. Within 3 months, over 6 million people visited, and when you consider the London population at that time was just over 2 million, that shows it had a tremendous international impact.
But it was the achievements of British industry that entranced the crowds who flocked to the Crystal Palace. The Great Exhibition was Britain's show. No other country came close in the production of steam engines, machine tools, the symbols of industrial might.
You go in and you see all these wonderful gadgets, all these inventions, all this evidence of British ingenuity and of British energy. And it's an advertisement to the world which says, this is the most progressive nation in the world. Look what it's produced. Isn't this marvellous?
Even the restrained columns of the Times newspaper swelled with rapture.
Those who were so fortunate as to see it hardly knew what most to admire. Around them, amidst them, above their heads was all that was beautiful and useful in nature or in art. Above them rose a glittering arch, far more lofty and spacious than the vaults of even our noblest cathedrals. Some were reminded of that day when all ages and climes would be gathered around the throne of their Maker.
The Crystal Palace achieved all that Prince Albert had hoped for and more. It convinced millions of ordinary people that the new technology could deliver a golden future not just for the rich and privileged, but for them all. It fired an enormous sense of patriotism and pride in the monarchy. But it also provoked feelings of national supremacy, a growing conviction that with such engines of power, the British could conquer the world. After the opening ceremony, the Queen gave thanks.
God bless my dear Albert. God bless my dearest country, which has shown itself so noble. Albert's name is immortalized.
The Prince, with more restraint, commented that the day's events had been quite satisfactory. The Great Exhibition marked the dawn of a new era of free trade. But Prince Albert's vision of world peace and the brotherhood of nations would prove more elusive.
Free trade is, in a sense, a form of imperialism, insofar as if anyone tries to oppose it, then the British government will take action against them, literally at the point of a cannon.
In the decade that followed the Crystal Palace, Britain would be plunged into two great conflicts that shattered Albert's illusions and set Victoria's empire on a dangerous and bloody route towards world domination. In the course of Victoria's long reign, 16 million Britons would leave the mother country for a new life overseas. Each of them, whether they were searching for fame or fortune, love or adventure, would help to make the empire of Queen Victoria the widest and most powerful the world has ever seen.
There was the feeling that this island, though then very, very beautiful, peaceful, proud, rich, in all ways successful. Nevertheless, it was cramped, it was small, it was drizzly. And over there, you know, at the end of the shipping routes, there was somewhere warm and hot and exciting. Temple bells rang, and ships sailed over limitless seas, and soldiers fought. It was a marvelous vision for somebody growing up in this little island here.
But whatever their personal dreams and ambitions, these hopeful emigrants took with them a baggage of ideas and values, beliefs and prejudices that would spread to the further corners of the earth and soak a significant part of it in blood. Most of those leaving the mother country in the 1850s were heading for the Queen's self-governing dominions of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, or the former colonies of the United States. Others were bound for the country that Victoria would one day describe as the most precious jewel in her crown, India. India was the greatest overseas territory that any empire has ever possessed. But it had been conquered not by the British Army, but by a private trading company. The East India Company had begun with a single warehouse on the west coast of India. When its trade was threatened by European rivals or Indian rulers, the company went to war. It employed its own private army of native troops, commanded by British and European officers. They won battle after battle. With each victory, thousands of new Indian recruits came over from the ranks of their defeated opponents. They swore an oath to their new employer.
To serve the Honourable Company faithfully and truly against all their enemies, while I continue to receive their pay and eat their salt.
That oath of loyalty was the most important single strand binding the British to India, and the most vulnerable. By the time of Victoria, the East India Company, with its vast native army, controlled a swath of territory across India 10 times the size of the British Isles, and with 5 times the population. The merchant adventurers had become conquerors, and to the victors went the spoils. The hookah-smoking agents or nabobs of the East India Company became a byword for splendid living and riches beyond the dreams of their countrymen in England.
They were generally well-educated, upper-middle-class Englishmen who went out partly to make money, as they nearly always did, but also to have fun and to have excitement and to have a bit of romance and to go somewhere where the horizons were wider and the opportunities were greater and the loot was better. There was no improving intention. They weren't bigoted at all, so many of them had Indian friends. Some of them had Indian wives. A lot of them had Indian mistresses and produced many Anglo-Indian children.
The Indian mistress, or Bibi as she was known, was an important, almost official feature of company life. Traditionally, she was installed in a house known as a bibigar, where she lived in some luxury with her children and servants. In its early days, the company had encouraged its white employees to take Indian wives, but the bibi had become the approved alternative. Bibis steadied the men, it was argued, and rooted the company in Indian soil. One officer wrote wistfully of the bibis,
"They are so amusingly playful, so anxious to please a person, one shrinks from the idea of encountering the whims or yielding to the furies of an Englishwoman."
One Englishwoman in particular was not amused.